The windshield wipers on Mark's Volvo were fighting a losing battle against the drizzle. It wasn't a storm, not really, just that pervasive, gray wash of water that defined November in the Pacific Northwest. He had passed the last marked town, a collection of gas stations, and a post office called Granite Falls 40 minutes ago. Now, it was just a mountain loop highway, a ribbon of wet asphalt flanked by Douglas firs so tall they blotted out the midday sky. Mark shifted gears, feeling the tires slip momentarily on a patch of wet pine needles as he turned onto the private gravel road. He was seeking isolation, and he had certainly found it. The project deadline was 3 weeks away, a complex back-end migration for a fintech startup that required absolute focus, the kind of focus he couldn't get in a Seattle apartment with the city's hum vibrating through the walls. The cabin appeared around a bend, looking exactly like the photos, which was a rarity. It was an A-frame stained a deep dark cedar, with a wraparound deck that glistened with moisture. It didn't look ominous, it just looked quiet. He parked next to a muddy Subaru Outback. Mrs. Gable, the owner, was waiting on the porch, clutching a cardigan tight around her chest. She was a woman in her 60s, practical and brisk, with hair the color of steel wool. "You made good time," she said, not offering a hand, which Mark appreciated. Roads can be slick this time of year. "It wasn't too bad," Mark said, grabbing his duffel bag from the trunk. The air here was different. Cleaner, sharper, smelling of wet earth and decaying leaves. "Is the internet decent?" "Satellite. It's consistent, mostly. Don't expect to stream 4K movies, but it'll handle your email." She unlocked the front door. The key turned with a heavy, satisfying clunk. The interior smelled of wood smoke and lemon polish. It was tidy, furnished with heavy furniture that looked like it came of the house 30 years ago. A stone fireplace dominated the living room. Mrs. Gable walked him through the essentials with the efficiency of a drill sergeant. The thermostat was finicky. Keep it at 68. The water heater was small. Wait 20 minutes between showers. The breaker box was in the utility closet if the microwave and the toaster were used simultaneously. "And the back door," she said, gesturing to a heavy wooden door off the kitchen that led to the rear deck. "The frame settles when it rains. The wood swells. You have to give it a solid push before you turn the deadbolt. Make sure it clicks. If you don't, the wind will blow it right open." Mark nodded, testing the handle. It felt solid. "I'm down the mountain in Verlet, if you need anything," she said, handing him the key ring. "But I assume you came here to be left alone." "I did," Mark said. "Then I'll leave you to it." By 4 p.m., Mrs. Gable was gone and Mark was truly alone. He spent the first evening unpacking. He set up his workstation on the sturdy oak dining table. 2 monitors, his laptop, a mechanical keyboard, and a noise-canceling headset he doubted he would need. The silence of the cabin was heavy. In the city, silence is just a lack of noise. Here, silence felt like a physical weight, a pressure against the eardrums. The only sounds were the house itself. The timber frame adjusting to the temperature drop as the sun went down. The refrigerator compressor humming to life, then shuddering to a halt. The rhythmic dripping of rain from the eaves onto the deck railing. Mark made a simple dinner of pasta and Jared sauce, ate it standing over the sink, and then sat down to work. He coded until 1 a.m. The productivity was intoxicating. No sirens, no neighbors walking on the floor above, just the code. When he finally went up to the loft bedroom, he fell asleep instantly. He didn't dream. The first 3 days passed in a blur of gray light and glowing screens. Mark fell into a rhythm. Wake up at 7 a.m. Coffee. Work until noon. A sandwich. A walk down the gravel driveway. To stretch his legs. Work until midnight. The isolation was working. He was ahead of schedule. But on the 4th afternoon, the weather shifted. The drizzle hardened into a steady, driving rain, and the wind picked up, coming down off the Cascades in gusts that buffeted the A-frame. Mark was on a conference call with his project manager, Sarah, at 2 p.m. The connection was spotty, the audio fragmenting every few seconds. "Mark, you're cutting out," Sarah's voice crackled. "Did you say the migration is static by Friday?" "I said Monday," Mark replied, leaning back in his chair and rubbing his eyes. "I'm finalizing the script now. Can you hear me?" "Barely." "Look, just upload the logs when you can." "Oh, and Mark, you sound tired. Get some sleep." The call dropped. Mark sighed and took off his headset. The silence rushed back in, louder than before. He stood up to stretch, his back cracking. He walked into the kitchen to refill his water glass. He stopped in the doorway. The back door was open. Not wide open, just ajar, maybe 3 inches. A gust of wind caught it, pushing it inward, then suctioning it back against the frame. Rain was spitting onto the linoleum floor, creating a dark, slick puddle near the welcome mat. Mark stared at it. He felt a prickle of annoyance, not fear. "The wood swells," Mrs. Gable had said. "You have to give it a solid push." He set his glass down and walked over. He checked the floor. The water hadn't traveled far, meaning it hadn't been open long. He grabbed a roll of paper towels and wiped up the mess. Then he stood up and examined the door. He closed it. He pushed his hip against it hard. He turned the deadbolt. Click. It felt secure. He gripped the brass handle and tugged. The door didn't budge. He tugged harder, put his weight into it. Locked. "Okay," he muttered to himself. The sound of his own voice was startlingly flat in the room. He went back to his desk. He tried to focus on the code, but a low-level distraction had set in. He found himself pausing every few minutes, listening. The wind was louder now, whistling through the gaps in the decking outside. Every time a gust hit the house, the timbers groaned. At 4:30 p.m., the light began to fade. Mark got up to turn on the floor lamp in the living room. As he passed the kitchen, he glanced at the door. It was closed. He felt a wave of relief that he hadn't realized he needed. He was being ridiculous. It was an old house. Latches slipped, wood warped. It was physics, not a phenomenon. He worked through dinner. By 9 p.m., the wind had died down, leaving behind a stillness that felt unnatural after the noise of the afternoon. The rain had stopped. Mark was deep in a complex SQL query when he heard it. It came from the kitchen. It was a sharp mechanical sound. Metal on metal. Click. It was the sound of the deadbolt retracting. Mark's fingers froze on the keyboard. His heart did a strange double thump against his ribs. He sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the darkness of the kitchen doorway. He waited for the squeak of hinges. He waited for footsteps. Nothing. He slowly took off his headset, setting it on the desk. The silence was absolute. "Hello," he called out. He felt foolish immediately. He stood up, his legs feeling heavy. He looked around for a weapon, settling for the heavy Maglite flashlight he had placed on the mantel. He gripped it, the cold aluminum biting into his palm. He walked to the kitchen, hugging the wall. He reached around and flipped the light switch. The fluorescent tube overhead flickered to life with a low buzz. The kitchen was empty. He looked at the door. It was closed. He let out a breath, a harsh exhale through his nose. He had imagined it, the house settling, a pipe knocking. He walked over to the door to prove it to himself. He looked at the lock. The deadbolt thumb turn was vertical. Unlocked, Mark stared at the brass piece of metal. He remembered locking it. He remembered the resistance. He remembered the click. He reached out and touched it. The metal was cold. He locked it again. Click. He backed away, keeping his eyes on the door. He checked the windows. They were all latched. He checked the front door. Locked tight. He didn't return to his desk. Instead, he went to the dining room, dragged one of the heavy oak chairs into the kitchen, and wedged the back of it under the doorknob. It was a cliche, something he'd seen in a dozen movies, but the physical resistance of the chair against the floor gave him a modicum of comfort. He didn't code anymore that night. He sat on the sofa, the flashlight next to him, watching the kitchen entrance. Around midnight, exhaustion overtook him. He went upstairs, leaving the lights on downstairs. He lay in bed, staring at the vaulted ceiling. The rain started again, a gentle tapping on the roof shingles. He closed his eyes. Step. His eyes snapped open. Step. It was downstairs. Distinct. Heavy. It wasn't the settling of the house. It was a sound of weight being transferred onto a floorboard. Specifically, the loose board near the fireplace that creaked when he stepped on it. Mark lay rigid, his breath trapped in his throat. He counted the seconds. Step. Slide. It sounded like someone wearing thick wool socks, lifting a foot and then sliding the other. It was a pacing sound. Slow. Deliberate. It moved from the fireplace toward the kitchen. Then silence. Then back toward the fireplace. Step. Slide. Step. Slide. Mark reached for his phone on the nightstand. 3:17 a.m. He thought about calling the police. And saying what? There's a noise in my rental cabin? He had checked the doors. The chair was there. If someone had broken in, he would have heard the chair scrape across the tiles. The pacing continued for 20 minutes. It was rhythmic, almost hypnotic. It didn't sound aggressive. It sounded anxious, like someone waiting for a phone call. Then it stopped, right at the base of the stairs. Mark waited for the first creak of the stair riser. The stairs were uncarpeted wood. It was impossible to ascend them silently. He gripped the flashlight he had brought up with him, his knuckles white. He waited for an hour. The sun began to bleach the gray sky outside the skylight. No one came up the stairs. When he finally worked up the courage to go down, fully dressed and armed with a flashlight, the living room was empty. The lights he had left on were still buzzing. The chair was still wedged firmly under the back door handle, but the air in the room felt different. Stale. Used. Mark checked the back door lock. It was still locked. He made coffee, his hand shaking slightly as he poured the water. He needed to be rational. Acoustic anomalies. Old houses carried sound in strange ways. Maybe it was an animal under the crawl space, a raccoon, or a possum moving against the floor joists. That made sense. That had to be it. He decided to get out of the house for a few hours. He needed supplies anyway. He drove into Granite Falls. The normality of the town was grounding. He bought groceries at the IGA. He stood in the checkout line behind a woman buying a birthday cake and a pack of menthol cigarettes. It was mundane. It was real. He stopped at the hardware store. He bought a slide boat, a heavy-duty surface boat made of galvanized steel. Doing some repairs? The man at the counter asked, chewing on a toothpick. Just securing a loose door, Mark said. Wind up there could be a bear. The man nodded. You at the old Gable place? Mark paused. Yes. The man rang up the screws. Nice spot. Quiet. Mrs. Gable keeps it up well, considering. Considering what? The man shrugged. Considering it sat empty for so long before she started renting it. Hard to keep the damp out when a house doesn't breathe. Mark drove back up the mountain. He felt foolish for buying the bolt, but he installed it anyway. He spent 20 minutes with a power drill, screwing the steel bracket into the solid wood of the door and the frame. He slid the bolt home. It was solid. Nothing was opening that door without taking a frame with it. That night, Mark tried to reclaim his routine. He put on noise-canceling headphones and played white noise rain sounds ironically. He focused on the screen. He worked until 10 p.m. He took the headphones off to use the bathroom. The silence was back, but it wasn't empty silence. It felt charged, like the air before a lightning strike. The hair on Mark's arm stood up. He walked into the kitchen. The slide bolt was engaged. The deadbolt was locked. The chair was in place. He poured a glass of water. As he raised a glass to his lips, he saw it. On the stainless steel surface of the refrigerator door, there was a smudge. He leaned closer. It wasn't just a smudge. It was a print. It looked like condensation or grease. It was the size of a hand, but the fingers were dragged, elongated, smearing downward. It was fresh. The edges were still contracting. Mark turned around slowly, putting his back to the fridge. The kitchen was empty. "Is someone here?" he asked. His voice cracked. No answer. He grabbed a rag and wiped the fridge door violently, erasing the mark. He went back to the living room and sat on the couch, the flashlight in his hand. He wasn't going to sleep. At 11:45 p.m., the temperature dropped. It wasn't a draft. A draft has direction. This was a sudden, localized removal of heat. Mark could feel the cold radiating from the center of the room. He could see his breath puffing in white clouds in the lamplight. He looked at the thermostat on the wall. The digital display was blank. He pulled his phone out of his pocket to check the time, but the screen was black. He pressed the power button. The battery icon flashed red. Empty, then died. He had charged it to 100% an hour ago. He looked at his laptop on the dining table. The screen flickered, then went black. The cabin was plunged into semi-darkness, lit only by the dying embers of the fire he hadn't stoked in hours. Then the sound came. It wasn't pacing this time. It was the sound of fabric moving, the rustle of heavy clothing. It was coming from the armchair in the corner, the one Mrs. Gable had said was her husband's favorite. Mark shone the flashlight at the chair. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the worn leather. The chair was empty, but as he watched, the leather seat began to depress. It happened slowly, agonizingly. It was as if an invisible person was lowering themselves into the cushion. The leather crinkled. The springs underneath creaked, a sharp, rusted sound. Mark watched, paralyzed, as the depression settled. The back of the chair shifted slightly, as if the occupant was leaning back, getting comfortable. The silence was deafening. Mark could hear the blood rushing in his ears. Then, the sound of a breath. It came from the chair. A long, shuddering inhale, wet and ragged, like someone surfacing from deep water. And then, a voice. It wasn't a whisper. It was a thought, pushed directly into his mind, bypassing his ears entirely. It didn't use words, but the intent was clear, sharp, and terrifying. Leave. Mark didn't think. He didn't pack. He didn't check the locks. He stood up, his legs moving on pure adrenaline. He grabbed his car keys from the coffee table. As he moved toward the front door, the sound of dragging began in the kitchen. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was the chair, the heavy oak chair he had wedged under the door handle. It was being dragged across the tiles, away from the door. Then the slide bolt. Clack. The sound of the metal bolt being thrown back. Mark, the front door opened and sprinted into the rain. He scrambled into the Volvo, jamming the key into the ignition. The engine turned over, roaring to life. He threw the car into reverse, spinning the tires on the wet gravel. The headlights swept across the front of the cabin. Through the rain-streaked windshield, he looked at the living room window. The lights inside were back on. The fire was roaring, flames licking up the chimney. And standing in the window, looking out, was a figure. It wasn't Mrs. Gable. It wasn't a burglar. It was a shape of pure static, a blur in the air that distorted the light behind it. But the hand pressed against the glass was clear. It was long, pale, and the fingers were dragged down the pane, just like the mark on the fridge. Mark didn't look back again. He drove down the mountain road, taking the corners too fast, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He drove for 3 hours straight, not stopping until he reached a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of Seattle. He sat in a booth, shivering uncontrollably, drinking bad coffee under the harsh fluorescent lights. He checked his phone. It turned on immediately, 85% battery. He opened his email to write Mrs. Gable, to tell her he was gone, to tell her to keep the deposit. There was a draft email in his outbox. He hadn't written it. He opened it. The timestamp was 11:47 p.m., right when the power had died. The subject line was blank. The body of the email contained a single line of text typed in a chaotic, scrambled font. ITSCOLDOUTSIDEMARKLETMEIN. Mark closed the laptop. He left it on the table. He walked out to his car and drove home, the city lights washing over him. But he couldn't feel the warmth. He could still feel the cold of the cabin, settled deep in his marrow, waiting